Violating community standards. That flag needs to come down immediately. The whole letter stated coldly, Marjorie Winters, the Oakridge Estates Homeowners Association president, tapped her manicured nail against the citation as she stood on Richard Harmon's front porch with a smug smile. Or the fines will continue to accumulate, Mr. Harmon. Rules are rules. Richard, a 72-year-old man with silver hair and stoic blue eyes, simply looked at the woman, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he carefully folded the citation and placed it in his pocket. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'll be contacting the Department of Defense about this matter, Richard said quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had faced far greater challenges. The statement made Marjorie's patronizing smile falter for just a moment before she recovered with a dismissive laugh. If you understand that respect is earned not by titles, but through character and service, write honor in the comments. Richard Harmon lived a deliberately quiet life in the suburban neighborhood of Oakridge Estates. His modest single-story ranch home stood out only for its impeccable maintenance and the simple flagpole installed in his front yard. The house itself was tastefully decorated but minimal, comfortable furnishings. Walls adorned with a few landscape paintings, shelves lined with history books, and a study containing a simple desk and computer. Neighbors knew him as the polite, reserved gentleman who always waved but rarely engaged in lengthy conversation. His daily routine was predictably ordinary: morning walks through the neighborhood, afternoon reading on his covered patio, occasional trips to the local grocery store and library. He drove a well-maintained but unremarkable sedan that was at least 15 years old. His clothing choices were equally understated: khaki pants, button-down shirts, sometimes a simple sweater in cooler weather. Nothing about Richard Harmon's appearance or lifestyle suggested anything beyond an ordinary retiree enjoying his golden years in peaceful suburban anonymity. What the residents of Oakridge Estates couldn't possibly know was that Richard Harmon had spent 37 years as a highly decorated special operations officer, whose missions remained classified at the highest levels. Before his retirement, as a colonel, he had led teams into situations so delicate and dangerous that acknowledgement of their existence was still restricted to a handful of officials with appropriate clearances. His expertise in counterterrorism, hostage extraction, and intelligence operations had shaped American foreign policy in ways that would never be publicly documented. After losing his wife Catherine to cancer 5 years ago, Richard had retreated further into his private world. The flag on his property, a special unit flag commemorating his fallen comrades, became one of his few visible connections to his former life. The flag wasn't flashy or political. It bore a simple emblem representing his unit, displayed beneath the American flag, which he raised and lowered with military precision each day. At dawn and dusk, the trouble began when Marjorie Winters was elected as president of the Oakridge Estates HOA 3 months ago. A corporate attorney with ambitions of local political office, she had campaigned on a platform of neighborhood beautification and property value protection. Her first official act was to revise and strictly enforce the community standards document, a dense 50-page rule book that most homeowners had never fully read. One of the newly emphasized regulations concerned displays of non-approved flags, banners, or insignia. According to the updated rules, only the American flag could be displayed, and even then, only on designated national holidays, using HOA-approved mounting fixtures. Richard's permanent flagpole, installed 15 years earlier with the previous HOA board's written approval, was now suddenly non-compliant. The first citation arrived in Richard's mailbox 2 weeks ago, a formal warning with highlighted references to specific violations, and a deadline to remove the unauthorized fixture and displays. Richard had carefully folded the letter and filed it away in his study drawer without taking any action. The second notice arrived yesterday, this time with a $250 fine and the threat of daily penalties if the situation wasn't remedied within 72 hours. When Richard failed to respond to the written notices, Marjorie decided a personal visit was warranted. Standing on his porch that morning, clipboard in hand and flanked by Bradley Wilson, the HOA vice president, she had delivered her ultimatum with barely concealed satisfaction. "Mr. Harmon, we've sent you to official notices regarding your non-compliant flag display," she began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Section 17, Paragraph 4 of the Community Standards clearly prohibits permanent flagpoles and any non-approved flags or insignia. Richard had listened patiently, standing ramrod straight in his doorway, his posture still reflecting decades of military bearing. The flagpole was approved by the board in 2010. "I have the documentation," he replied evenly. Marjorie's smile tightened. "The current board has revised those standards, Mr. Harmon. Previous exemptions are no longer valid." All homeowners received notification of the updated guidelines 3 months ago. "That flag honors men who died serving this country," Richard explained, his voice remaining calm but taking on a slight edge. "Men whose names most Americans will never know because their missions remain classified." Bradley Wilson, a 40-something investment banker who had joined the HOA board primarily to network with neighbors, shifted uncomfortably beside Marjorie. "Look, Mr. Harmon, we respect your service. Maybe we could work something out if you'd be willing to move the display to your backyard, where it's not visible from the street. That rather defeats the purpose of a flag, doesn't it?" Richard observed quietly. Marjorie cut in before Bradley could respond. "The rules apply equally to everyone, Mr. Harmon. Military background doesn't exempt you from community standards that all homeowners agreed to when purchasing property here." She held out the citation. "This is a formal notice of violation with the associated fine. Additional daily penalties of $100 will begin accruing if the non-compliant items aren't removed within 72 hours. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Richard accepted the paper without comment, his weathered hands steady as he examined the document. After a moment, he looked up, his faded blue eyes meeting Marjorie's with a gaze that had once stared down warlords and terrorists. "I understand you're doing what you believe is your job," he said evenly. "However, this flag and what it represents fall under protections that supersede HOA regulations." Marjorie's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me, no, Mr. Harmon. Homeowners Association covenants are legally binding agreements. There are no exemptions for personal sentimentality. Regardless of what your flag means to you personally, it's not about sentimentality," Richard replied. "It's about authorization under Department of Defense Directive 13-47 regarding memorial displays for special operational units." Marjorie laughed outright at this, not bothering to hide her incredulity. "Department of Defense Directive, Mr. Harmon, with all due respect, this is a civil matter between you and the Homeowners Association, not a military issue. The DoD has no jurisdiction over our community standards." "That's not entirely accurate," Richard stated calmly. "I'll be contacting the Department of Defense about this matter. Violating community standards. That flag needs to come down." Immediately, Marjorie had responded with her prepared statement. Which brings us back to the beginning of our story. After Marjorie and Bradley left his porch, Richard closed his front door quietly and walked to his study. The room was modest but organized with military precision. A simple wooden desk faced the window overlooking his backyard garden. Bookshelves, lined to walls, filled with historical volumes, military strategies, and philosophical texts. A filing cabinet stood in the corner, containing decades of meticulously organized documents. Richard sat at his desk and opened the bottom drawer, removing a leather-bound address book that appeared decades old. He flipped through the pages with deliberate care until he found the entry he was looking for. Then he picked up his phone and dialed a number that few civilians would ever have access to. After navigating through several security protocols and verification steps, Richard was connected to an office deep within the Pentagon. General Blackwood's office answered a crisp, professional voice. "This is Colonel Richard Harmon, retired. Authorization code Sierra Echo November Tango India November Echo Lima. Richard stated clearly. "I need to speak with General Blackwood regarding a covenant for situation." There was a brief pause on the line, verifying, "Sir, please hold." The momentary silence was followed by, "Authorization confirmed. Colonel Harmon, General Blackwood, is currently in a briefing. Would you like to leave a message or shall I interrupt?" "No need to interrupt," Richard replied. "Please inform him that I'm invoking covenant for protections. Regarding a memorial display, local authorities are attempting enforcement actions against protected insignia. My contact information remains unchanged." "Understood, Colonel. I'll personally ensure the General receives this message immediately following his current briefing." "Do you require immediate intervention?" Richard glanced at the citation on his desk. "No, there's a 72-hour compliance window. A response within 48 hours will be sufficient." "Acknowledged, sir. Expect contact within 24 hours." After ending the call, Richard walked to his front window and looked out at the flag gently waving in the afternoon breeze. The emblem, a stylized eagle gripping what appeared to be lightning bolts, meant nothing to most observers. To Richard and a select group of veterans, it represented Operational Detachment Sierra, a classified special operations unit whose missions had saved countless American lives during some of the most dangerous conflicts of the past for decades. The unit officially didn't exist in any public record. Its members operated under multiple layers of cover and deniability. Their successes remained classified, their casualties often recorded under conventional units or training accidents. The flag was one of the few tangible acknowledgments of their service and sacrifice, designed to be recognizable only to those who needed to know. Richard had lost 17 brothers in arms during his years with the unit. The flag honored them in a way that their absent stars on memorial walls could not. Department of Defense Directive 13-47, established after years of advocacy by senior commanders, provided specific protections for displaying such memorial items, even in communities with restrictive covenants like homeowners associations. The following morning, Richard followed his usual routine, up at 5:30 a.m. Stretching exercises developed during his military career, but modified for his aging body. A light breakfast, and then the ceremonial raising of both flags precisely at sunrise. He noticed Bradley Wilson watching from across the street, but gave no indication that he was aware of the observation. At 9:45 a.m., Richard's phone rang. The caller ID displayed a Washington, D.C. area code. "Richard Harmon," he answered. "Colonel Harmon, General Marcus Blackwood here." The deep voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. "I received your message regarding the covenant for situation. Are you well?" "I'm fine, Marcus," Richard replied, his tone warming slightly. "Apologies for involving you in something so seemingly trivial." "Nothing trivial about honoring our fallen, Richard. You do the same for me. I've reviewed the initial assessment. Your local HOA is attempting to force removal of the detachment. Sierra Memorial flag. Correct. New board leadership. New interpretation of the rules. They're threatening daily fines." General Blackwood's sigh was audible. "Some people have no sense of perspective. I assume you've explained the situation?" "I mentioned Directive 13-47. They dismissed it outright." "Of course they did," Blackwood replied, a hint of weariness in his voice. "Civilians who enjoy exercising what little authority they have. Do you have the documentation from the previous board approval?" "Yes, all properly filed and preserved." "Excellent. Here's what we'll do. I'm dispatching Major Sanderson from Legal Affairs to your location tomorrow. She'll bring the official notification regarding protected memorial displays and handle the interaction with your HOA representatives. I'm also sending Lieutenant Colonel James from Public Affairs. He's been briefed on the appropriate level of detail that can be shared without compromising classified information." Richard frowned slightly. "Is that level of response necessary?" "I don't want to embarrass anyone unnecessarily," General Blackwood chuckled. "Richard, always considering others, even when they're in the wrong. The response is appropriate for two reasons. First, Directive 13-47 exists precisely to prevent this type of situation. Second, there have been several similar incidents across the country recently. The department believes a clear precedent needs to be established to prevent further problems. For our personnel, especially those from special operations backgrounds. After finishing the call, Richard spent the remainder of the day tending to his garden and reading on his patio. He observed several neighbors walking past his house, clearly curious about the flag that had suddenly become controversial. A few offered friendly waves, which he returned with his customary nod. That evening, as Richard was preparing dinner, his doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Bradley Wilson standing on his porch, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Mr. Harmon, I hope I'm not interrupting your evening," Bradley began, his usual confidence noticeably diminished. "I wanted to speak with you privately about the flag situation." Richard studied the younger man for a moment, then nodded. "Would you like to come in for a cup of coffee?" Bradley looked relieved. "Thank you, that would be nice." Richard led him to the kitchen where a pot of coffee was already brewing. The space was immaculate, organized with the efficiency of someone who had learned to live simply and orderly. He gestured for Bradley to take a seat at the small kitchen table. While he prepared 2 mugs, "Cream or sugar?" Richard asked. "Black is fine, thank you," Bradley replied. Glancing around the kitchen, his eyes lingered on a framed photograph on the counter. Richard in military dress uniform standing beside a woman with a warm smile. "Your wife," Richard nodded as he placed a mug in front of Bradley. "Catherine. She passed 5 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry for your loss," Bradley said, genuinely. After a moment of respectful silence, he continued, "Mr. Harmon, about the flag situation. I wanted you to know that I didn't fully support Marjorie's approach. The board never actually discussed individual enforcement actions against existing fixtures like yours." Richard took a sip of his coffee. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Wilson. Please, call me Brad." He fidgeted with his mug. "The thing is, Marjorie has been very aggressive about enforcement since becoming president. Several neighbors have received citations for various infractions: unapproved garden gnomes, wrong shade of exterior paint, unauthorized bird feeders. Your flag is just the latest target." "And why are you telling me this?" Richard asked. Directly, Bradley looked uncomfortable. "Because I've been doing some research since yesterday. I found mentions of this Department of Defense directive you referenced, and while I couldn't access the actual document, there were enough references to make me think you weren't just making it up. I tried to discuss it with Marjorie this morning, but she dismissed my concerns. She's planning to make an example of your case, to show the neighborhood that no exceptions will be tolerated." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Were you serious about contacting the Department of Defense?" Bradley asked, curiosity evident in his voice. "Yes," Richard replied simply. Bradley waited for elaboration, but when none came, he continued, "Look, I joined the HOA board because it seemed like a good way to meet people and maybe have some input on community events. I didn't sign up for harassing veterans about memorial displays. If there's anything I can do to help resolve this reasonably, I'd like to offer my assistance." Richard studied the younger man for a long moment. "There will be representatives from the Pentagon here tomorrow to address the situation. Officially, it would be helpful if you could ensure that Ms. Winters and any other relevant board members are available for a meeting. Would 2 p.m. work?" Bradley nearly choked on his coffee. "Representatives from the Pentagon here tomorrow?" His eyes widened. "You really did call the Department of Defense?" "As I said I would," Richard confirmed mildly. "Marjorie isn't going to believe this," Bradley muttered, then caught himself. "I mean, yes, I can make sure the relevant board members are available. Should we meet here or at the community center?" "The community center would be more appropriate. Less personal that way," Richard suggested. Bradley nodded, still looking slightly dazed. "I'll arrange it." He finished his coffee quickly and stood. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Harmon, and for your service, whatever it entailed. My father served in Vietnam, so I have some appreciation for what military personnel sacrifice." Richard walked him to the door. "Your father's generation faced challenges few civilians could comprehend. I hope he found peace when he returned. He had long ago accepted that the purpose of his service was to protect a society where people could live ordinary lives, concern themselves with property values and garden gnomes. and never have to understand the darkness that existed in the world. In many ways, Marjorie Winters' petty authoritarianism was proof that he and his brothers-in-arms had succeeded in their mission. The following morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect early autumn day with just enough crispness in the air to hint at the changing seasons. Richard followed his usual morning routine, including the ceremonial raising of both flags at precisely 0630 hours. As he secured the halyard with practiced movements, he noticed increased activity in the neighborhood. Residents walking dogs or retrieving newspapers were lingering longer than usual, glancing toward his property with undisguised curiosity. Word had clearly spread about the impending confrontation. By noon, Richard had changed into a simple but immaculately pressed navy blue suit, not his military dress uniform, but clothing that conveyed appropriate respect for the occasion. He reviewed his documentation one final time, then placed everything in a leather portfolio that had been a retirement gift from his team. At 1:30 p.m., a black Suburban with government plates pulled up in front of his house. Two individuals emerged. A woman in her early 40s wearing an Army service uniform with the gold oak leaf of a major, and a man of similar age in a charcoal suit with the bearing that immediately identified him as military despite his civilian attire. Richard met them at the door before they could ring the bell. Major Sanderson, Lieutenant Colonel James, he greeted them, recognizing their ranks from General Blackwood's description. "Thank you for coming." Major Elena Sanderson, a woman with intelligent eyes and her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, offered a crisp salute. "Colonel Harmon, sir, it's an honor to meet you." Richard returned the salute out of respect, though as a retired officer, it wasn't required. "The honor is mine, Major. Please, come inside briefly before we head to the meeting." Lieutenant Colonel Michael James, the public affairs officer, extended his hand. "Colonel, I've studied many of your operational frameworks during my training. Your anchor extraction plan is still used as a case study at the War College." Richard shook his hand with a firm grip. "Just doing the job, Colonel. Much of that material should have remained classified. Only the methodology is discussed, sir, not the specific operation." James assured him, "Your innovations saved lives inside." Richard offered them water, which they accepted gratefully. Major Sanderson opened her briefcase and removed several official documents bearing Department of Defense letterhead. "Colonel, I've reviewed your situation thoroughly." She began professionally. "Your memorial display is unquestionably protected under Directive 13-47, Section 5, which specifically addresses commemorative displays for specialized units. Additionally, since you obtained prior written approval from the Homeowners Association before installation, there are multiple grounds to challenge the current enforcement action." Lieutenant Colonel James added. General Blackwood requested, "We handle this with minimal public attention, but with sufficient formality to ensure no further issues arise. We've prepared documentation that clearly outlines the legal protections, without revealing classified information about Operational Detachment Sierra." Richard nodded appreciatively. "That's a delicate balance to maintain." "Indeed, sir, Major." Sanderson agreed. However, the directive was specifically designed to allow veterans of classified operations to honor their fallen comrades without compromising national security. She hesitated briefly before continuing. "Colonel Harmon, if I may speak candidly." "Please do, Major." General Blackwood shared some limited background about your service record. "It's extraordinary, sir. The idea that you're being harassed over a memorial to your fallen team members is..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It reflects a profound misunderstanding of what that flag represents." Richard's expression remained composed, but a flicker of appreciation showed in his eyes. Most civilians can't comprehend what they've never experienced. "Major, Ms. Winters isn't acting from malice, merely ignorance. Your perspective is commendable." "Sir," Lieutenant Colonel James remarked, "not everyone would be so understanding." At 1:50 p.m., they departed for the community center, arriving to find the parking lot unusually full for a weekday afternoon. Word had clearly spread throughout the neighborhood about the showdown between Richard Harmon and the HOA. As they entered the building, The buzz of conversation immediately diminished as residents noticed the uniformed officer. Accompanying Richard, Bradley Wilson met them in the lobby, his expression a mixture of nervousness and relief. "Mr. Harmon, thank you for coming. We've set up in the main conference room." He glanced at Richard's companions with barely concealed awe. "Are these the representatives you mentioned?" Richard performed the introductions with military efficiency. "Mr. Bradley Wilson, HOA Vice President, Major Elena Sanderson, Department of Defense Legal Affairs, and Lieutenant Colonel Michael James, Department of Defense Public Affairs." Bradley shook their hands, visibly impressed. "It's an honor to meet you both. Please follow me." The conference room was arranged with a long table at the front, where Marjorie Winters sat with 3 other HOA board members and a man in a suit, whom Richard recognized as Alan Peterson, the association's attorney. Approximately 30 residents had filled the audience chairs, all watching with undisguised interest as Richard and the Pentagon officials entered. Marjorie's expression shifted from smug confidence to confusion as she observed Major Sanderson's uniform. She leaned over to whisper something to the attorney, who frowned and shrugged slightly. Bradley directed Richard and his companions to seats at the opposite end of the table. Before taking his own place with the board, "Since everyone is present, I believe we can begin," he announced. "This special meeting of the Oakridge Estates Homeowners Association has been called to address the enforcement action regarding Mr. Richard Harmon's property." Marjorie quickly seized control of the proceedings. "Thank you, Bradley. As most of you know, the board has been working diligently to ensure our community standards are uniformly enforced. To maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics, Mr. Harmon has been cited for non-compliant flag displays and an unauthorized permanent flagpole." She directed a practiced smile toward Richard. "We're gathered today to resolve this issue amicably." Richard remained silent, his posture relaxed but alert, the stance of a man who had faced far more intimidating situations than a homeowners association meeting. Marjorie continued, "Mr. Harmon has apparently suggested that some sort of military regulation exempts him from our community standards. While we certainly respect his service, the association's legal counsel has advised us that HOA covenants are binding civil agreements that take precedence in residential matters." She gestured toward the attorney. "Mr. Peterson has prepared documentation explaining the legal basis for our enforcement action and the penalties that will apply if the violations aren't remedied." Before Peterson could speak, Major Sanderson stood. "If I may address the board?" Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. Marjorie looked momentarily flustered. "I'm sorry, you are Major Elena Sanderson, Department of Defense Legal Affairs Division. I've been dispatched by the Office of General Marcus Blackwood, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to address this matter officially." A murmur rippled through the assembled residents. Peterson straightened in his chair, suddenly alert. "This is highly irregular," Marjorie protested. "This is a civil matter between the homeowners association and Mr. Harmon. Under normal circumstances, you would be correct, Ms. Winters," Major Sanderson acknowledged. "However, the situation involves Department of Defense Directive 13-47, which specifically addresses memorial displays honoring special operations personnel." She placed an official document on the table. "This directive, established by executive order and reinforced by congressional legislation, provides specific protections for veterans of specialized units, particularly those whose operations remain classified for national security reasons." Peterson reached for the document, scanning it with professional interest. His expression grew increasingly concerned as he read. Major Sanderson continued, "Colonel Richard Harmon served with distinction in operational units whose activities remain classified at the highest levels. The memorial flag on his property honors fallen comrades whose sacrifices cannot be publicly acknowledged through traditional means. This directive ensures they are not forgotten." Lieutenant Colonel James added, "The Department of Defense takes these matters very seriously. These memorials are often the only public acknowledgement these heroes receive." Marjorie's face had flushed an uncomfortable shade of red. "Colonel Harmon, I thought you said you were retired military. You never mentioned being a colonel. It didn't seem relevant to our discussion about community standards, Richard replied simply. Peterson leaned over to whisper urgently in Marjorie's ear. She listened, her expression shifting from indignation to uncertainty. Furthermore, Major Sanderson continued, our investigation confirms that Colonel Harmon obtained proper written authorization from the previous Homeowners Association board before installing his flagpole. That agreement constitutes a binding covenant that cannot be retroactively invalidated by a new board without specific legal proceedings, which have not occurred. She placed another document on the table. This is an official notice from the Department of Defense affirming that Colonel Harmon's memorial display is protected under federal law. Any attempt to force its removal or to impose financial penalties would constitute a violation of that protection. The room had grown completely silent. Even the most gossip-hungry residents seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. Marjorie looked to Peterson for guidance. The attorney cleared his throat. If I may have a moment to review these documents more thoroughly. This is unexpected legal territory. Of course, Major Sanderson agreed. However, I should note that General Blackwood has expressed personal interest in this matter. Colonel Harmon served under his command during several critical operations. While Peterson reviewed the documents, Lieutenant Colonel James addressed the assembled residents. While I cannot discuss the specific nature of Colonel Harmon's service due to ongoing classification requirements, I am authorized to share that his actions directly saved American lives in circumstances most civilians will thankfully never experience. Bradley Wilson, who had been watching the proceedings with increasing discomfort, spoke up. I think it's clear that there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we should consider withdrawing the citation pending further legal review. Peterson finally looked up from the documents. Ms. Winters, a word in private, please. Marjorie, Bradley, and Peterson stepped into an adjoining room for a brief consultation. The remaining board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, while the audience buzzed with whispered conversations. Richard sat quietly, his expression neutral. Major Sanderson leaned closer to him. Are you all right, sir? Perfectly fine, Major, Richard assured her. This is considerably less stressful than negotiating with tribal warlords in the Hindu Kush. A hint of a smile touched her lips. I imagine so, sir. When Marjorie and the others returned, the attorney looked grave while Marjorie's earlier confidence had visibly evaporated. Bradley appeared relieved. Peterson addressed the room. After reviewing the documentation provided by the Department of Defense representatives, I have advised the board that Directive 13-47 does indeed create federal protections that supersede Homeowners Association covenants in this specific circumstance. Additionally, the prior written approval for Colonel Harmon's flagpole installation remains legally binding. Marjorie cleared her throat. Based on this new information and our legal counsel's advice, the board will be withdrawing the citation issued to Colonel Harmon. The fines will be canceled immediately. She attempted to maintain her dignity despite the obvious setback. We appreciate the Department of Defense representatives taking the time to clarify this matter. A palpable sense of relief spread through the room, though many residents seemed disappointed that the anticipated confrontation had ended so anticlimactically. Lieutenant Colonel James stood on behalf of General Blackwood and the Department of Defense. We appreciate the association's cooperation in this matter. The protection of memorial displays honoring our fallen service members is not just a legal obligation but a moral one. As the meeting began to disperse, several residents approached Richard to shake his hand, many apologizing for the association's actions or expressing gratitude for his service, though none knew the specific nature of that service. Richard accepted their words with quiet grace, neither encouraging nor discouraging the attention. Bradley Wilson made his way to Richard as the crowd thinned. Colonel Harmon, I want to personally apologize for this entire situation. It should never have escalated to this point. No harm done, Mr. Wilson, Richard assured him. Please, it's Brad, he insisted, and there's something else you should know. During our private discussion just now, Peterson strongly advised Marjorie that pursuing this further could potentially expose the HOA to federal action. She's agreed to step down as president. Effective immediately. Richard raised an eyebrow. That wasn't my intention, I know, Bradley acknowledged. But it's the right outcome. The board has asked me to step in as interim president until a proper election can be held. My first official act will be to review all recent citations to ensure they're reasonable and necessary. He hesitated before continuing. I've also suggested we consider establishing a community veterans committee to advise the board on matters that might affect former service members. I was hoping you might consider participating, though I understand if you prefer your privacy. Richard considered the request. I'll think about it. Change comes slowly to organizations, even small ones like homeowners associations. Don't expect to transform everything overnight. Wise advice. Bradley nodded. Thank you. As Richard prepared to leave with Major Sanderson and Lieutenant Colonel James, Marjorie Winters approached, her earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. Colonel Harmon, she began stiffly, I want to apologize for any disrespect. Had I known about your service record, Ms. Winters, Richard interrupted gently. The nature of my service doesn't change the fundamental principle at stake. That flag honors men whose names most Americans will never know. They died ensuring that communities like ours can worry about property values and aesthetic standards instead of survival. He met her gaze directly. Their sacrifice deserves respect regardless of whether the person displaying the memorial is a colonel or a private. The directive protects the memorial, not the individual. Marjorie had the grace to look chastened. I understand. Thank you for the clarification. Outside the community center, Richard thanked Major Sanderson and Lieutenant Colonel James for their assistance. It was our honor, Colonel, Major Sanderson assured him. General Blackwood sends his regards and asks that you call him directly. If there are any further issues, please convey my appreciation to the General, Richard replied. And my apologies for involving the department in something that should have been resolved locally. Lieutenant Colonel James shook his head. Sir, with respect, this is exactly why Directive 13 to 47 exists. You're not the first veteran of classified operations to face these challenges, and unfortunately, you won't be the last. Each case like this establishes important precedent. As they prepared to depart, James added, General Blackwood mentioned you might be interested in speaking with some of the newer generation of operators. Many of them have studied your methodologies without knowing the man behind them. If you're ever willing to share your insights, even in a limited capacity, it would be invaluable. Richard considered this thoughtfully. Perhaps. It's been a long time since I've been active in those circles. The fundamentals you established remain relevant, Sir, Major Sanderson assured him. Some things change with technology and politics, but human nature and the principles of effective operations endure. After they departed, Richard walked slowly back to his home, observing the neighborhood with fresh eyes. Children played in front yards, couples worked in gardens, ordinary people living ordinary lives, the very thing he and his team had fought to protect, at his own property. He paused to look up at the two flags gently waving in the afternoon breeze. The American flag represented the nation they had served. The unique flag below it represented the price some had paid for that service. Both deserved to fly freely. That evening, Richard sat on his back patio, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. He held a small glass of bourbon, a ritual he performed on days when memories of fallen comrades felt particularly close. He rarely drank, but this tradition provided a moment of reflection and respect. His phone rang, the special line few people had access to. Richard Harmon, he answered. Richard, it's Marcus. General Blackwood's familiar voice came through. Just checking in to see how everything went today. Your team handled it perfectly, Marcus. The situation is resolved. Glad to hear it. Sanderson and James spoke highly of you. Not that I'm surprised. Richard took a sip of his bourbon. The flag remains. That's what matters, indeed. There was a pause before Blackwood continued. Richard, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you. How much do you keep up with current operations? Not much, Richard admitted. I stepped away for a reason. "I understand and respect that," Blackwood assured him. "However, there's a situation developing that bears remarkable similarities to the Sarajevo operation. You led in '94. The team assigned to it could benefit enormously from your insights." Richard gazed at the darkening sky, memories of that particular mission surfacing, the complexity, the risks, the narrow margins for error, and ultimately, the success that saved hundreds of civilians whose names they never knew. "I'm not looking to pull you back in," Blackwood clarified. "Just a consultation, 2 days at most, at the Pentagon. All expenses covered, of course. It's not about the money, Marcus. I know. It's never been about that for you." The general's voice softened slightly. "It's about making sure these young operators have every advantage, every insight that might help them complete their mission and come home safely." Richard thought about the faces on his memorial wall, the ones who hadn't come home. He thought about the flag outside that honored their sacrifice, and he thought about the next generation, facing dangers in a world that grew no less threatening despite changing politics and technologies. "When?" he asked finally. "Next Tuesday. I'll send a car. I'll drive myself," Richard countered. "Some habits die hard." General Blackwood chuckled. "Of course, I'll have everything arranged." "And Richard, thank you." After ending the call, Richard finished his bourbon and went inside. In his study, he opened a locked cabinet that contained materials from his former life, operational manuals, after-action reports, analytical frameworks he had developed. He hadn't reviewed them in years, but his mind immediately began organizing the relevant information for the consultation. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a familiar sense of purpose. Not the full weight of command responsibility, but the opportunity to contribute, to pass on knowledge that might save lives. The flag outside stood not just as a memorial to the past, but as a connection to the continuing mission. Through Blackwood's request, he had been reminded that while he had retired, the work continued, carried forward by new operators facing new challenges, but guided by enduring principles. As darkness fell completely, Richard switched on his desk lamp and began reviewing the Sarajevo operation documentation. Some memories remained razor-sharp despite the passing years: the terrain, the threat assessment, the extraction plan. That had seemed impossible until they executed it flawlessly. Other details required refreshing, and he made careful notes on aspects that might be relevant to the current situation. The quiet house around him no longer felt like a retirement retreat, but more like the operations center it had once been. During his active years, a place where critical thinking and strategic planning could make the difference between success and failure, between life and death for those in the field. The Tuesday morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Richard Harmon emerged from his home, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that, while not extravagant, was significantly more formal than his usual attire. He carried a leather briefcase containing the notes and documents he had carefully prepared over the previous days. For the first time in years, he had experienced the familiar pre-mission focus, the mental clarity that came with purpose and responsibility. His neighbors, now aware of at least some portion of his background, watched with newfound respect as he loaded his briefcase into his sedan and departed for Washington, D.C. Many wondered where the unassuming retiree was headed in such formal attire, but none dared to ask. The events of the previous week had transformed their perception of the quiet man. They thought they knew. The drive to the Pentagon took just over an hour, traffic flowing smoothly despite the usual morning congestion around the Capitol. Richard had timed his departure to arrive precisely at 0800 hours, not from anxiety about being late, but from the ingrained military precision that had governed much of his life. As he approached the massive building that housed the heart of American military operations, memories flooded back, not just of missions and briefings, but of the weight of decisions made within those walls, decisions that sent men and women into harm's way with lives hanging in the balance. Richard parked in the visitor section and approached the security checkpoint with measured steps. He presented his retired military ID and the visitor authorization that General Blackwood had arranged. The young Marine at the desk examined the documents carefully, then looked up with a flash of recognition. "Colonel Harmon, he said, his voice betraying a hint of awe. "General Blackwood mentioned you would be arriving. It's an honor to meet you, sir." Richard nodded politely, somewhat surprised by the recognition. "Thank you, Corporal. The General has sent an escort for you, sir," the Marine continued, gesturing to a uniformed Army captain who approached from the Interior Security Station. The captain saluted crisply. "Colonel Harmon, Captain Sarah Reynolds. I've been assigned to escort you to the secure briefing area." Richard returned the salute out of courtesy, though as a retired officer it wasn't required. "Lead the way, Captain." As they navigated the Pentagon's labyrinthine corridors, Richard noted how little had changed in the years since his last visit. The building remained a study in organized chaos, personnel in various uniforms and civilian attire moving with purpose, carrying folders and tablets containing information that shaped national security decisions daily. "Have you served at the Pentagon long, Captain?" Richard asked, breaking the silence. "Just over a year, sir," she replied. "I was previously deployed with the 5th Special Forces Group in Syria." Richard nodded appreciatively. "Combat experience provides valuable perspective for Pentagon assignments. That's what General Blackwood said when he requested me for his staff," she agreed. "Though I admit, the politics here can be more challenging than enemy fire." A hint of a smile touched Richard's lips. "Some battlefields are more straightforward than others." They arrived at a secure area requiring additional verification. After passing through multiple checkpoints, Captain Reynolds led Richard to a conference room, marked only with a numerical designation. She opened the door, revealing General Blackwood and 4 other military personnel seated around a polished wooden table. General Marcus Blackwood, a broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked dark hair and the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command, rose immediately. "Richard, thank you for coming." He extended his hand with genuine warmth. Richard clasped it firmly. "Marcus, good to see you." Blackwood gestured to the others in the room. "Colonel Richard Harmon, let me introduce you to the team. Lieutenant Colonel James Garrison, current commander of Special Operations Detachment Echo Aline." Weathered officer with calculating eyes nodded respectfully. "Major Sophia Chen, Intelligence Analysis." A sharp-eyed woman in her 30s acknowledged him with professional courtesy. "Captain David Ramirez, Operations Planning." A younger officer with the focused intensity characteristic of Special Operations personnel, and Dr. Elise Foster, Cultural and Linguistic Specialist. A civilian woman whose unassuming appearance belied the analytical sharpness in her gaze. Richard greeted each with a nod as he took the offered seat at the table. "I appreciate you all making time for this consultation." "The appreciation is entirely ours." "Colonel," Lieutenant Colonel Garrison responded, "your operational frameworks quite literally shaped modern special operations doctrine." General Blackwood resumed his seat at the head of the table. "Richard, before we begin the formal briefing, I want to thank you personally for agreeing to this consultation. The situation we're facing has concerning parallels to your Sarajevo operation, and your insights could be invaluable." Richard opened his briefcase, removing his carefully prepared notes. "I've reviewed the Sarajevo files. What can you tell me about the current situation?" Blackwood nodded to Major Chen, who activated a secure display screen on the wall. "Colonel, what I'm about to share is classified at the highest levels. For the next hour." Richard listened intently as the team outlined the current operation. A splinter faction of extremists had seized control of a remote research facility in the Caucasus Mountains, taking hostage several American scientists working on an international climate research project. Intelligence suggested the hostage takers were using the scientists as leverage to obtain advanced technology that could be weaponized. "The regional terrain presents significant challenges," Captain Ramirez explained, displaying topographical maps that reminded Richard starkly of the Sarajevo operation. "Mountainous approaches, limited access routes, extreme weather conditions, and the diplomatic situation?" Richard inquired, knowing from experience that political constraints often presented greater obstacles than physical terrain. Dr. Foster leaned forward, extremely delicate. "The facility sits near a contested border region. 3 different countries could claim jurisdiction, and none are willing to acknowledge the situation publicly for fear of escalating regional tensions, which means no official military action can be acknowledged, Richard concluded. Precisely. General Blackwood confirmed. Any intervention must maintain absolute deniability. The host government will disavow knowledge if anything goes wrong, and our own diplomatic channels will do the same. Lieutenant Colonel Garrison continued, we have a team prepared for insertion, but the extraction plan remains problematic. The closest secure extraction point is 70 kilometers from the target, through mountainous terrain. Weather conditions in the region are deteriorating rapidly. Richard studied the maps and intelligence assessments with practiced eyes. You're concerned about the parallel to Sarajevo because you're facing the same extraction challenge. Moving non-combatant personnel with potentially limited mobility through hostile territory with no support infrastructure. Yes, Blackwood admitted. And the last time a situation this complex was successfully resolved was when your team executed the impossible in '94, Garrison finished. We've studied the redacted reports, but the critical details of how to manage the extraction remain classified, or were never documented. Richard was silent for a moment, his mind processing the information with the same analytical precision that had once made him legendary within the intelligence community. The official reports never captured the most crucial aspect of the Sarajevo extraction. He said finally. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. The key wasn't in the tactical approach or the equipment, Richard continued. It was understanding that conventional extraction thinking was the greatest liability. We succeeded because we abandoned the traditional exfiltration doctrine entirely. He stood and approached the map display. May I? Major Chen handed him a digital stylus. Richard began marking the terrain map, identifying features that weren't obvious on the standard topographical display. When facing impossible extraction scenarios, the solution often lies in what's already there, but not recognized, he explained. In Sarajevo, we utilized local infrastructure in ways it wasn't designed for, creating extraction possibilities that didn't officially exist. For the next 3 hours, Richard outlined an approach that gradually transformed the team's understanding of the operation. He didn't simply offer tactical suggestions, he fundamentally reframed how they perceived the problem. As the morning wore into afternoon, the atmosphere in the room shifted from respectful consultation to genuine collaborative planning. This approach carries significant risks, Captain Ramirez noted, though his expression revealed growing confidence. All operations do, Richard replied. The question isn't whether risks exist, but whether they're the right risks for the specific circumstances. Sometimes the seemingly safer conventional approach actually carries greater danger than the unconventional alternative. Dr. Foster, who had been relatively quiet, suddenly spoke up. Colonel Harmon, your cultural assessment of the local populations is remarkably nuanced. Most military planners wouldn't factor in the seasonal migration patterns of the semi-nomadic groups in that region. Richard's expression remained neutral, but there was appreciation in his eyes. Details matter, Dr. Foster. Sometimes the difference between success and failure isn't firepower or technology, but understanding human patterns that have existed for centuries. By mid-afternoon, what had begun as a consultation had evolved into a comprehensive operational redesign. The team broke for a late lunch, which was brought into an adjacent room where they could continue discussions without losing momentum. As they ate, General Blackwood pulled Richard aside. Your insights have already transformed this operation's viability. I can't help but wonder what the intelligence community lost. When you stepped away, Richard took a sip of water. Everything has its season, Marcus. I served mine. Did you? Blackwood asked quietly. Or did you just shift battlefields? That flag you fought for at home, that was another kind of operation, wasn't it? Richard considered this perspective. Perhaps, though considerably less complex than what you're facing here. I'm not so sure. Blackwood replied. The principles remain the same, understanding the terrain, recognizing the actual, rather than perceived obstacles, maintaining focus on the core objective despite distractions. Before Richard could respond, Lieutenant Colonel Garrison approached with additional questions about the operational timeline. The afternoon session progressed, with increasing focus on implementation details. By 1700 hours, the team had developed a revised operational plan that incorporated Richard's approach, while adapting it to current technological capabilities and intelligence resources. Colonel Harmon, Garrison said as they reviewed the final framework, "With your permission, I'd like to incorporate elements of this methodology into our standard training protocols. The conceptual framework you've outlined has applications beyond this specific operation." Richard nodded. "Of course, though I'd suggest you continue evolving it rather than treating it as doctrine. The moment methodology becomes rigid is the moment it begins to fail." As the formal briefing concluded, General Blackwood addressed the team. "I want to thank Colonel Harmon for his invaluable contribution today. The revised operational plan will be finalized overnight and presented to the Secretary tomorrow morning." The team members expressed their appreciation as they gathered their materials. Each took a moment to personally thank Richard before departing, leaving him alone with General Blackwood. "Your team is impressive," Richard observed once they were alone, "particularly Dr. Foster and Major Chen. Their analytical capabilities are exceptional." "High praise coming from you," Blackwood acknowledged. "I've tried to build a team that balances technical expertise with innovative thinking." He paused, "Which brings me to something I wanted to discuss with you privately." Richard raised an eyebrow questioningly. "This consultation has confirmed what I already suspected." Blackwood continued, "Your strategic thinking hasn't diminished. With retirement, if anything, the distance has given you valuable perspective, Marcus." Richard began, sensing where the conversation was heading. "Hear me out, Richard." Blackwood interrupted gently. "I'm not asking you to return to active service or even regular Pentagon duties, but there's a role for someone with your experience. As a strategic consultant to special operations planning, limited engagement, complete flexibility regarding your schedule and location. You could work entirely from home if you preferred, with secure communications established." Richard's expression remained neutral, but his mind was already processing the proposition with characteristic thoroughness. "The younger generation needs mentors who understand both the technical aspects and the human dimensions of what we do," Blackwood continued. "People who've faced impossible scenarios and found paths forward. Your experience shouldn't just be filed away in classified archives." "I stepped away for a reason, Marcus, I know, and I respect that decision." Blackwood's voice softened. "But today I watched you come alive in that briefing room in a way I haven't seen since before Catherine's passing." The mention of his late wife caused a flicker of emotion to cross Richard's normally composed features. "She always said your mind needed challenges worthy of its capabilities." Blackwood reminded him gently that retirement shouldn't mean intellectual stagnation. Richard was silent for a long moment. "I'll consider it," he finally said. "No promises beyond that. That's all I ask." Blackwood stood, signaling the end of their meeting. "Whatever you decide, know that your contribution today will likely save lives, both the hostages and the operators tasked with extracting them." They walked together through the Pentagon corridors toward the exit, discussing lighter matters: mutual acquaintances, changes in Washington politics, Blackwood's recent fishing trip to Montana. As they reached the security checkpoint, Blackwood extended his hand once more. "It's been good having you back in this building, even briefly. These halls are filled with strategic thinkers, but genuine strategic wisdom is considerably rarer." Richard shook his hand firmly. "Good luck with the operation, Marcus. If you need any further input before execution, you know how to reach me." The drive home gave Richard time to process the day's events and Blackwood's proposition. The familiar rhythm of highway driving allowed his mind to work through the implications with methodical precision. By the time he turned onto his street in Oakridge Estates, the evening sun was casting long shadows across manicured lawns. Richard noticed immediately that something was different. Several of his neighbors were gathered near his property, and as he pulled into his driveway, he saw the reason. His flagpole had been augmented with professional lighting that now illuminated both flags. Even in the gathering dusk, Bradley Wilson approached as Richard stepped out of his car. "Welcome back, Colonel," he greeted with genuine warmth. "I hope you don't mind the addition to your display." Richard surveyed the tasteful lighting system that had been installed. "This is unexpected. The neighborhood association voted unanimously to install proper illumination for your flags," Bradley explained. "It's the least we could do to show our respect. The lights are automated. They'll come on at sunset and turn off at sunrise, all powered by a small solar panel that's nearly invisible from the street." Richard was momentarily at a loss for words. An unusual experience for someone who had navigated complex diplomatic negotiations. In crisis situations, James Peterson from Two Streets Over installed it. Bradley continued. "He's a retired electrician. Did it all to code, I assure you. And Mrs. Abernathy from the garden club planted these." He gestured to a new arrangement of red, white, and blue flowers circling the base of the flagpole. The community wanted to make amends. In a sense, Richard studied the thoughtful additions. "Please convey my appreciation to everyone involved." "Actually," Bradley said hesitantly, "several neighbors are gathering for an informal barbecue at the Johnsons' place across the street. They were hoping you might join us if you're not too tired from your trip." Richard's initial instinct was to politely decline. Social gatherings had never been his preference, even before retirement. But something about the day's events, about Blackwood's words regarding isolation, made him reconsider. "I'd be happy to join you," he found himself saying. "Let me change, and I'll be over shortly." The surprise on Bradley's face was evident, quickly replaced by genuine pleasure. "Wonderful, nothing formal. Just neighbors getting to know each other better." Inside his house, Richard placed his briefcase in his study and changed into more casual clothing. As he prepared to join the neighborhood gathering, he found himself reflecting on the parallel paths the day had presented. The possibility of reconnecting with his former professional world through Blackwood's consultancy offer, and the opportunity to establish genuine connections within his community after years of self-imposed isolation. The neighborhood barbecue proved surprisingly enjoyable. Richard found himself engaged in conversations that ranged from local politics to international affairs, from gardening tips to baseball statistics. His neighbors, while clearly curious about his background, respected his privacy, focusing instead on including him in the present community rather than prying into his past. Sometime during the evening, Bradley approached him again, offering a fresh drink. "I've been meaning to ask, Colonel, the Veterans Advisory Committee I mentioned, have you given it any thought?" Richard nodded. "I have. I'd be willing to participate, though I should warn you that bureaucracy has never been my strong suit." Bradley laughed. "After what happened with Marjorie, I think bureaucracy could benefit from a little straight talk." He grew more serious. "Several other veterans in the neighborhood have expressed interest as well. Thomas Reeves from Maple Street served in Afghanistan, and Maria Gonzalez from the townhomes was a Navy corpsman in Iraq. Good people to have involved." Richard acknowledged, "though I'd suggest keeping the committee's focus practical rather than ceremonial. Veterans appreciate recognition, but they value substantive support more." "That's exactly the kind of insight we need," Bradley affirmed. "The first meeting is next Thursday evening. If you're available, I'll be there," Richard promised. Later that night, after returning home, Richard stood at his living room window, looking out at his illuminated flags. The thoughtful addition from his neighbors had transformed the display into something more significant, not just his personal memorial, but a community acknowledgement of service and sacrifice. He thought about Blackwood's offer, about the day spent helping plan an operation that might save lives. He thought about the unexpected connections forming with his neighbors after years of isolation. And he thought about Catherine, about what she would have advised in this moment of potential transition. Richard moved to his study and opened a drawer in his desk, removing a photograph he rarely looked at. Catherine in her garden, smiling at the camera with the vibrant joy that had defined her personality. Even during his most classified operations, during the darkest periods of his career, she had been his anchor to normality, to humanity. "What would you tell me now, Kate?" he asked softly, though no audible answer came. He could almost hear Her practical wisdom in his mind, life is for the living. Richard, service takes many forms. Find the one that suits this chapter. Richard placed the photograph carefully on his desk rather than returning it to the drawer. Then, he opened his laptop and began composing an email to General Blackwood, outlining the conditions under which he would consider the strategic consultant position. As he typed, he felt a sense of purpose taking shape, not the all-consuming mission focus of his active duty years, but something more balanced, more sustainable, a way to contribute his expertise without surrendering the peace he had found in retirement, a way to honor the past while embracing the present. Outside, the flags moved gently in the night breeze. Illuminated by the lights his community had installed in a gesture of respect and reconciliation. The memorial to fallen comrades remained, but it now existed alongside new connections, new possibilities. Richard finished the email and sent it, then closed his laptop. Tomorrow would bring responses and decisions, plans and adjustments. For tonight, it was enough to acknowledge that even in retirement, even after stepping back from the world of high-stakes operations and classified missions, his experience still had value. His wisdom could still save lives. His presence in this community could still make a difference. The battle for respect had been won not through force or confrontation, but through quiet dignity and unwavering principle, the same qualities that had defined his military career. The flag still flew, now with greater meaning than before, and the man who had fought for it found himself not at the end of a journey, but at the beginning of an unexpected new chapter. 3 months had passed since Richard Harmon's meeting. At the Pentagon, the late autumn had given way to winter, bringing occasional snow flurries to Oakridge Estates. The neighborhood had changed subtly, but significantly in that time, not in its physical appearance but in its sense of community. The morning ritual remained unchanged. Richard still raised his flags at precisely 0630 hours each day, regardless of weather, but now he often noticed neighbors pausing respectfully during their morning routines, some offering a nod or quiet greeting as he completed the ceremony. What had once been a solitary act had become a quietly acknowledged community touchstone. This particular morning carried the crisp stillness that comes only with freshly fallen snow. Richard secured the halyard with practiced movements, the flag standing out vividly against the pale winter sky. As he turned to go inside, he noticed young Ellie Parker watching from her driveway. Across the street, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Good morning, Ellie," he called with a slight smile. "Morning, Colonel," the 8-year-old replied, her voice bright despite the early hour. "My dad says your special flag is for heroes who can't have their names on regular monuments. Is that true?" Richard approached the white picket fence separating his property from the sidewalk. "That's one way to describe it," he acknowledged. "Some service members work on missions that remain secret even after they're completed." Ellie considered this with the serious contemplation unique to children. "That seems sad. To be a hero but not get recognized. Recognition comes in many forms," Richard explained gently. "The most meaningful often isn't public." The girl nodded as though this made perfect sense, then glanced toward her house where her father was calling her name. "I have to go to school. Bye, Colonel." Richard watched her dash back to where Mr. Parker waited by their car, waving briefly to the man before returning inside his own home. These small interactions, once rare, had become increasingly common as the neighborhood's perception of him evolved from the private old man to the respected colonel. Inside, Richard's home had undergone subtle transformations as well. The study that had once been merely functional now served as a secure workspace, equipped with encrypted communications systems installed under General Blackwood's authorization. The bookshelves contained new volumes on current geopolitical situations, alongside his historical references. The wall that had previously displayed only Catherine's photograph now held several carefully framed commendation letters, not for vanity, but as reminders of the impact of carefully considered strategies. Richard prepared his usual breakfast, steel-cut oats with fresh fruit, and carried it along with his coffee to the study. His new routine included reviewing secure communications each morning, providing insight on operational planning for Special Operations Command on an as-needed basis. The arrangement with General Blackwood had evolved into something that balanced meaningful contribution with the independence Richard valued in retirement. As he settled at his desk, his secure tablet indicated 3 new messages requiring his attention. 2 were routine updates on operations he had consulted on previously. The third, marked with higher priority, was from Lieutenant Colonel Garrison regarding the Caucasus extraction operation. Richard opened it immediately, scanning the carefully worded message with practiced efficiency. The operation had been successfully executed 3 days earlier, with all hostages safely recovered and the team extracted without casualties. Garrison's message included a personal note of appreciation for Richard's strategic framework, which had proven crucial when unexpected weather conditions forced modifications to the original plan. Your emphasis on adaptable infrastructure utilization saved lives, Garrison had written. The team was able to pivot to the secondary approach exactly as you suggested. When the primary route became compromised, Richard felt a profound satisfaction that transcended mere professional pride. Lives saved, missions accomplished. The core purpose that had driven his entire career remained valid even in this new, limited capacity. He composed a brief acknowledgement, congratulating Garrison and requesting a complete after-action report for analysis once it became available. The remainder of the morning passed in focused work, reviewing operational assessments, annotating strategic proposals, providing the perspective that only decades of experience could offer. This consulting role had found a perfect balance, allowing Richard to contribute his expertise without the administrative burdens or political navigations that had often frustrated him during active service. At 1100 hours, Richard's secure phone rang, the direct line used only by General Blackwood and a select few others with appropriate clearance. Richard Harmon, he answered. Richard, Marcus here. Blackwood's voice came through clearly. Just received Garrison's preliminary report on the Caucasus operation. Outstanding success. So I understand. Congratulations. The congratulations belong partly to you, Blackwood countered. Your strategic framework made the difference when conditions deteriorated. The secretary specifically asked who had developed the adaptive infrastructure approach. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. You mentioned my involvement to the secretary? Only in appropriate terms, Blackwood assured him. You're officially listed as a strategic consultant with historical operational expertise, but he was impressed enough to request a more comprehensive briefing on the methodology. That could be arranged. Richard acknowledged, though I'd suggest having Garrison deliver it. He's integrated the approach effectively with current capabilities, always. Deflecting credit, Blackwood noted with a hint of amusement. That's actually not the main reason for my call. There's something else I'd like to discuss with you, something potentially significant. Richard listened as Blackwood outlined a new initiative being developed within the Department of Defense, a specialized mentorship program pairing retired special operations personnel with active teams facing particularly complex challenges. The program would focus not on tactical training, which was already extensively covered, but on the strategic thinking and adaptive problem-solving that often determined mission success in unpredictable environments. We're looking for someone to help design the program framework, Blackwood explained. Someone who understands both the operational realities and the knowledge transfer challenges. Someone respected enough that both the old guard and the new generation will listen. You have several qualified candidates on active duty, Richard pointed out, none with your unique combination of experience and perspective. Blackwood countered, plus your current consulting role has demonstrated that remote contribution is viable for this type of work. You wouldn't need to relocate or significantly change your current arrangements. Richard considered the proposition thoughtfully. Send me the preliminary outline. I'll review it and provide initial feedback. Excellent. You'll have it within the hour. Blackwood paused before adding, one more thing, Richard. The first training module would take place at Fort Bragg next month. If you're amenable to helping design the program, would you consider delivering the inaugural session in person? It would establish the tone and authority for the entire initiative. The request gave Richard pause, remote consulting from his Study was one thing. Appearing in person before active special operations teams was quite another. "I'll consider it after reviewing the materials," he said finally. "Fair enough. And Richard, the Caucasus team asked me to convey their personal thanks. 7 families will be celebrating reunions because of that operation." After the call ended, Richard sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on how his retirement had evolved over these past months. What had begun as a simple stand for his right to display a memorial flag had rippled outward, reconnecting him not only with his former professional world, but also with his local community in ways he hadn't anticipated. The remainder of Richard's day included a scheduled call with the Veterans Advisory Committee he had helped establish for the neighborhood association. What had started as a small group focusing primarily on ensuring HOA regulations didn't inadvertently impact veterans had expanded into a community support network. They now coordinated everything from helping elderly veterans with home maintenance to establishing a scholarship fund for children of military families in the neighborhood. Bradley Wilson, who had proven to be a thoughtful and effective HOA president, had fully supported the committee's initiatives. Even Marjorie Winters, after her initial embarrassment, had eventually offered her legal expertise to help veterans navigate benefit systems, a surprising but welcome redemption that Richard had quietly encouraged. The committee call focused on finalizing plans for the upcoming Veterans Recognition event at the community center. Richard had initially resisted the idea of any public ceremony, but had eventually been persuaded that the event could serve a meaningful purpose beyond symbolic recognition. "Colonel, we've confirmed 5 representatives from veterans service organizations will attend with information booths," reported Maria Gonzalez, the former Navy corpsman who had become the committee's most organized member, and the VA regional outreach coordinator has committed to bringing a mobile processing unit for benefits inquiries. "Excellent work, Maria," Richard acknowledged. "What about the local employers we discussed?" 7 confirmed. Thomas Reeves, the Afghanistan veteran, answered, including 2 specifically interested in hiring veterans with security clearances. "They're prepared to conduct preliminary interviews on site." "Good. This event should offer tangible benefits, not just handshakes and platitudes," Richard noted with satisfaction. "Bradley, has the board approved the community center usage without charge?" "Unanimously." Bradley confirmed, and several board members have personally contributed to the refreshment budget. As the call continued, Richard found himself impressed once again by how effectively the committee had embraced his vision of practical support over ceremonial recognition. These were people of action, not just words, a quality he had always valued in his operational teams. After the call concluded, Richard checked the time and noted it was nearly 1600 hours. Time for his regular afternoon walk through the neighborhood. This habit, once a solitary exercise undertaken primarily for physical health, had gradually transformed into something more communal. He now regularly encountered neighbors who would walk alongside him for portions of his route, sharing conversations that ranged from neighborhood concerns to international affairs. Today, as he rounded the corner onto Maple Street, he encountered Thomas Reeves clearing snow from his driveway. The younger veteran waved in greeting. "Afternoon, Colonel." "Perfect timing. I just finished. And Sarah made hot chocolate if you'd care to stop in for a few minutes." Richard, who once would have politely declined such an invitation, found himself accepting without hesitation. That would be appreciated. "Thomas, thank you." Inside the Reeves' comfortable home, Richard sat at their kitchen table while Sarah served rich hot chocolate in mismatched mugs. Their 2 children, momentarily shy in his presence despite having met him several times, soon warmed up when Richard asked about their school projects. Displayed prominently on the refrigerator, "Mr. Rodriguez says my report on Afghanistan was the best in class," 10-year-old Michael informed him proudly. "Dad helped me, but I did all the writing myself. That's quite an accomplishment." Richard acknowledged seriously, "Understanding other cultures is one of the most important skills you can develop." Thomas caught Richard's eye over his mug, a look of understanding passing between them. 2 men who had learned that lesson through experience rather than classroom instruction. Colonel Harmon knows more about different cultures than almost anyone, Thomas told his son. He traveled to places most people never see. Like where? Michael asked eagerly. Richard considered how to answer, balancing security constraints with the child's genuine curiosity. Many places across Europe, Asia, and Africa. He replied carefully, each with its own history and traditions worth understanding. Is that why you have this special flag? Michael's younger sister Lily asked, her voice small but interested. Daddy says it's for remembering important people. That's exactly right, Richard confirmed. It honors people who served our country in special ways. The conversation shifted to more general topics, and Richard found himself surprisingly comfortable in this family setting. There had been a time, particularly after Catherine's passing, when such domestic scenes had been painful reminders of the family they had never been able to have, their hopes for children dashed by complications. From an operation early in his career that had left Catherine unable to conceive. Now, however, he found a different kind of connection possible, not as a father or grandfather, but as a mentor, an elder with experience to share. The role felt appropriate, meaningful in its own way. After finishing his hot chocolate and declining a second cup, Richard thanked the Reeves family and continued his walk, reflecting on how his circle of meaningful connections had expanded. From the focused professional relationships renewed through Blackwood's consultancy offer to the community bonds forming in Oakridge Estates, his life had developed new dimensions of purpose and engagement. Returning home as dusk approached, Richard completed his evening flag ceremony, lowering both flags with the same precision he applied to raising them each morning. The illumination system installed by his neighbors activated automatically, bathing the now empty flagpole in subtle light. Inside, Richard prepared a simple dinner and carried it to his study, where Blackwood's promised materials awaited review. The proposed mentorship program was ambitious but thoughtfully structured, focusing on developing the adaptive thinking capabilities critical for modern special operations, rather than simply transferring standard procedures. As he reviewed the documents, Richard began making notes, not just reactive comments on what had been proposed, but proactive suggestions for enhancing the program's effectiveness. Ideas flowed with surprising energy, drawing on both his operational experience and his more recent observations about knowledge transfer across generations. By the time he finished his meal, Richard had filled several pages with annotated comments and suggestions. The program had merit, significant merit, and the opportunity to help shape it appealed to him more than he had initially expected. The prospect of delivering the inaugural session in person, however, still gave him pause. Richard's contemplation was interrupted by the chime of his regular phone. The caller ID showed Bradley Wilson's name. "Good evening, Bradley," he answered. "Colonel, I hope I'm not disturbing your evening," Bradley began, his voice carrying an unusual tension. "But there's a situation developing that I thought you should know about." Richard was immediately alert. "What's happening?" "The town council just announced an emergency zoning review that could impact Oakridge Estates," Bradley explained. "They're considering rezoning the undeveloped woodland behind our neighborhood for commercial use. A developer has proposed a shopping center that would require clearing most of the forest and would directly border several properties, including yours." Richard's property backed onto the wooded area that many residents valued, for both its natural beauty and the privacy buffer it provided. "What's the timeline for this decision?" "That's the concerning part," Bradley said grimly. "They've fast-tracked the process. Public comment period is only 2 weeks, with the council vote scheduled immediately after." The announcement was buried in the town's website, rather than properly communicated to affected residents. Intentionally obscured, Richard noted, recognizing the tactic from countless political maneuvers he'd observed over the years. "Exactly. By the time most residents notice, the comment period will be nearly over." Bradley's frustration was evident. "I've called an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow evening, but we're struggling to determine how to effectively oppose this. These developers have deep pockets and likely already have council members in their corner." Richard considered the situation with the same analytical approach he applied to operational challenges. "This requires a strategic response, not just emotional objections. Who on the council might be sympathetic to environmental or residential concerns? Councilwoman Martinez has a background in environmental science, and Councilman Peterson has generally favored residential interests over commercial development, Bradley replied. But we need more than 2 votes on a 7-member council. We need information first, Richard stated. The specific development plan, environmental impact assessments, traffic studies, property value impact analyses. Without data, we're just making noise. The HOA doesn't have resources to commission those kinds of studies on short notice, Bradley pointed out. Perhaps not, Richard acknowledged. But we have residents with relevant expertise. Thomas Reeves works in civil engineering, doesn't he? Maria Gonzalez has connections at the university's environmental science department. And I believe the Johnson's daughter is an attorney specializing in land use. Bradley was silent for a moment. You're suggesting we form a response team from within the neighborhood? Exactly. Identify the relevant expertise, assign specific responsibilities, coordinate the findings, and present a unified, fact-based opposition. Richard's voice took on the quiet authority that had once guided special operations teams through complex missions. This is no different from any other strategic challenge. Assess the situation, identify resources, develop a plan, and execute with precision, Colonel. Bradley said with newfound determination. Would you be willing to help coordinate this effort? Your strategic thinking is exactly what we need. Richard found himself agreeing without hesitation. I'll help organize the response. Send me whatever documentation you have on the proposal, and I'll begin preliminary analysis before tomorrow's meeting. After ending the call, Richard sat back in his chair, a slight smile touching his lips. The irony wasn't lost on him. Months ago, he had stood alone against the HOA over his right to display a flag. Now, he was being asked to help lead that same organization in protecting the community's interests. He turned back to his computer and opened a new document, beginning to outline a strategic approach to opposing the development. The skills honed through decades of military and intelligence operations, gathering information, analyzing motivations, identifying leverage points, developing contingency plans, were perfectly applicable to this civilian challenge. As he worked, Richard realized that this community issue had pushed the Pentagon mentorship program temporarily to the back of his mind. Yet, in a way, he was already engaged in exactly the kind of knowledge transfer Blackwood had described, applying specialized expertise to guide others through complex challenges. The parallels between his former career and his current life were becoming increasingly clear. The contexts differed dramatically, but the core principles remained the same. Identify what matters, develop a strategy to protect it, and execute with unwavering commitment. By midnight, Richard had developed a comprehensive response framework, identifying key information needs, potential allies, leverage points, and communication strategies. He had created a structure that would allow the neighborhood to respond effectively despite the compressed timeline, maximizing their impact with the resources available. As he prepared for bed, Richard glanced out his window toward the illuminated flagpole in his front yard. The flags would be raised again at 0630, hours as they were every day, a reminder of commitments kept and principles maintained. But now that symbol stood for something broader than his personal memorial to fallen comrades. It represented a connection to community, to purpose that extended beyond his individual experience. The battle over his flag had seemed like an ending point months ago, a final stand for respect and recognition. Instead, it had become a beginning, opening doors to renewed purpose in multiple dimensions of his life. From the Pentagon consultancy that allowed him to continue saving lives through strategic guidance, to the neighborhood leadership that gave him a new kind of mission, Richard Harmon had found not just a quiet retirement, but a meaningful third act. The flag still flew, honoring those who had given everything. But now it also represented something more, the ongoing commitment to service that transcended uniform and formal duty, the understanding that experience gained at great cost was meant to be shared, not simply remembered. As Richard drifted toward sleep, he found himself at peace with the direction his life had taken. Tomorrow would bring a new challenge in the form of the development threat. Next month might bring him to Fort Bragg to share wisdom with a new generation of operators. Both represented opportunities to make a difference, to ensure that the sacrifices commemorated by his flag continued to have meaning in the world of the living. The HOA had once fined him for a flag the Pentagon had indeed called, but the real story wasn't about vindication or authority. It was about finding purpose when purpose seemed complete, about standing for principles in both global theaters and local communities, and about understanding that true respect isn't demanded but earned through consistent action and unwavering integrity. The flag would fly tomorrow, as it did every day, not as a symbol of battles won, but of commitments kept. And Richard Harmon, once a shadow warrior who had operated in the world's darkest corners, would continue his newest mission, building connections, sharing wisdom, and demonstrating that the greatest service often comes not from position or power, but from the quiet strength of experience applied with humility and purpose. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.